Karen slammed her coffee cup down on the table, the hot liquid sloshing over the rim and onto the edge. Unbelievable. She shouted into her phone, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of the entire coffee shop. This is the worst service I've ever experienced. How hard is it to get a simple latte right? She continued ranting, oblivious to the annoying glances from the other patrons. Her perfectly manicured brows were furrowed, her cherry-red lips twisted into an ugly scowl. The young barista behind the counter hesitated, unsure of how to handle the situation. He'd been on the receiving end of angry customers before, but this woman's entitlement and sheer volume were next level. He exchanged a nervous glance with his coworker, who shrugged helplessly. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience," the barista called out tentatively. "If you'd like, I can make you a fresh latte." Karen whirled around, her long blonde hair whipping across her face. "A fresh latte. Do you have any idea how long I've been waiting for this one?" she snapped. "I don't have time for your incompetence." The other customers shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads in disbelief. One man in the corner put down his book and glared at Karen, his jaw clenched. "Ma'am, I really must insist that you lower your voice," the barista said, his tone firmer now. "You're disturbing the other patrons." Karen scoffed and turned back to her phone call. "Can you believe this?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "They're trying to tell me to be quiet in my own coffee shop." The man in the corner stood up and approached Karen's table. "Excuse me, miss, but I'm going to have to ask you to keep it down," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "The rest of us are trying to enjoy our coffee in peace." Karen's eyes narrowed as she glared up at the man. "How dare you?" she hissed. "This is a free country, and I'll talk as loud as I want." The man shook his head and turned to the barista. "I think you should call the police. This woman is clearly causing a disturbance." Karen's eyes widened, and she gasped in outrage. "The police? How dare you?" She jabbed a finger at the man. "I'll have you know I'm a respected member of this community, and I won't stand for this kind of harassment." The barista hesitated, unsure of what to do. But before he could make a decision, Karen had already dialed 911 on her phone. "Yes, hello. I'd like to report an assault," she said, her voice shaking with false panic. "There's a man here who's harassing me and threatening me." The man stared at Karen in disbelief, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not the one causing a scene here, ma'am," he said. But Karen's sharp glare silenced him, and within minutes, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. The police officers arrived quickly, their squad cars screeching to a halt outside the coffee shop. Karen immediately jumped up from her seat, waving her arms frantically. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she cried. "This man has been harassing me and threatening me. I felt unsafe, so I had to call for help." The officers looked puzzled as they surveyed the scene. The other customers in the shop were watching with a mix of annoyance and disbelief, while the man who had confronted Karen stood calmly with his hands raised. "Ma'am, can you explain to us what happened?" one of the officers asked. Karen launched into a dramatic retelling of the events, embellishing and exaggerating at every turn. "I was just minding my own business, enjoying my coffee, when this man came over and started yelling at me," she said, her voice quivering with feigned fear. "He was threatening me, saying he was going to call the police on me." The officer turned to the man, who shook his head in disbelief. "That's not what happened at all," he said. "This woman was loudly complaining and disturbing the entire coffee shop. I simply asked her to keep it down, and she's the one who called the police." The officers looked skeptical, and one of them stepped forward to address Karen directly. "Ma'am, is that true? Were you the one causing a disturbance?" Karen's face flushed with indignation. "Absolutely not," she insisted. "I'm a respected member of this community, and I would never behave in such a way. This man is clearly trying to harass me and make me look bad." The officer sighed and turned to his partner. "It seems we have a bit of a he said, she said situation here. Do we have any other witnesses who can corroborate what happened?" A few of the other customers hesitantly raised their hands, and one by one, they stepped forward to recount what they had seen. Their accounts unanimously backed up the man's version of events, leaving Karen's story in tatters. The officers exchanged a glance, then turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, it appears that you were the one causing the disturbance, and that the other gentleman was simply asking you to keep it down. We're going to have to issue you a citation for disorderly conduct." Karen's mouth fell open in shock, and her face turned a deep shade of red. "What? This is an outrage," she sputtered. "I demand to speak to your supervisor." But the officers were having none of it. They swiftly issued the citation and escorted Karen out of the coffee shop, leaving the other patrons to return to their drinks with a mix of relief and amusement. As Karen was led away, she could be heard muttering under her breath, "This isn't over. I'll make sure those officers pay for this." The next day, Karen stormed into the police station, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on the countertop. She demanded to speak to the officer who had issued her the citation, her voice dripping with indignation. "I want to file a formal complaint," she said, her eyes narrowed. "That officer had no right to treat me the way he did. I'm a respected member of this community, and I won't stand for this kind of harassment." The officer on duty sighed and motioned for her to take a seat. "Ma'am, I'll need to speak with the officer who handled the call. Can you give me a few minutes to track him down?" Karen huffed and plopped down in one of the hard plastic chairs, crossing her arms over her chest. She glared at the other people in the station, silently daring them to challenge her. After a short wait, the officer who had issued the citation, Officer Jenkins, emerged from the back office. He approached Karen with a neutral expression, his hands clasped behind his back. "Ma'am, I understand you have a complaint about the incident yesterday at the coffee shop," he said, his tone calm and even. Karen launched into another tirade, waving her hands wildly as she recounted her version of events. "That man was the one causing a disturbance, not me," she insisted. "I was simply enjoying my coffee when he came over and started yelling at me. And then you officers had the audacity to issue me a citation." Officer Jenkins listened patiently, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Ma'am, I reviewed the statements from the other witnesses, and they all corroborated the man's account. You were the one who was causing a scene and disturbing the other patrons." Karen's face flushed with anger. "That's ridiculous. Those people were obviously lying. I'm telling you, I did nothing wrong. I demand that you rescind that citation immediately." The officer shook his head. "I'm afraid I can't do that, ma'am. The evidence clearly shows that you were the one who was in the wrong. I'm not going to overturn the citation just because you're demanding it." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm on the board of directors for this city's police department. I can make sure you never work another day in your life if you don't do as I say." Officer Jenkins regarded her with a steely gaze. "Ma'am, I don't care who you are or what position you hold. I'm going to do my job and enforce the law, regardless of any threats or demands you make. Now, if you have nothing further, I suggest you leave the station before I have to escort you out." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her face a mask of pure fury. She stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair in the process. "This isn't over, Officer Jenkins," she spat. "You'll hear from my lawyer, and I'll make sure you regret the day you crossed me." With that, she stormed out of the station, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. True to her word, Karen wasted no time in hiring a high-powered attorney to take on her case. Within a week, she had filed a formal complaint against Officer Jenkins, alleging abuse of power and violation of her civil rights. The attorney, a slick-talking man named Robert Danvers, immediately set to work, bombarding the police department with a flurry of legal documents and threatening to take the matter to court if their demands were not met. "My client is a respected member of this community," Danvers declared in a press conference. She was simply enjoying her coffee when this officer decided to single her out and harass her. "We will not stand for this kind of unjust treatment, and we are prepared to take this all the way to the top if necessary." The police department, however, stood firm. They had reviewed the evidence, and they were confident that Officer Jenkins had acted within the bounds of the law. They refused to rescind the citation or take any disciplinary action against him. Undeterred, Danvers upped the ante, filing a lawsuit against the city and demanding a hefty sum in damages. He painted a picture of a fragile, innocent woman who had been the victim of a power-hungry cop. But as the case made its way through the courts, the cracks in Karen's story began to widen. The video footage from the coffee shop, which Danvers had initially dismissed as irrelevant, clearly showed Karen's disruptive behavior and the man's attempts to calm the situation. The other witnesses, who had been reluctant to testify at first, now came forward with detailed accounts of what they had seen. They described Karen's entitled attitude, her loud and abusive language, and her refusal to cooperate with the officers. Danvers tried desperately to poke holes in their testimonies, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge, clearly unimpressed by Karen's attempts to play the victim, ultimately ruled in favor of the police department, dismissing the lawsuit and upholding the citation. As Karen stormed out of the courtroom, her face a mask of fury, Danvers hurried to catch up with her. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Rosenthal," he said, his tone apologetic. "But the evidence was simply too strong. There was nothing more I could do." Karen rounded on him, her eyes blazing. "That's not good enough, Danvers," she hissed. "I paid you a lot of money to make this go away, and you failed. Now, I'm going to make sure you regret the day you took me on as a client." Danvers raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Please, Mrs. Rosenthal, let's not do anything rash. I'm sure we can work something out." But Karen was already stalking away, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the courthouse. She had a new plan in mind, and this time, she was determined to make everyone pay for daring to cross her. In the days following her defeat in court, Karen's rage only continued to simmer. She couldn't believe that she, a pillar of the community, had been subjected to such humiliation and injustice. And she was determined to make everyone who had wronged her pay dearly. First, she set her sights on Officer Jenkins, the one who had dared to issue her that infuriating citation. She began making a series of anonymous phone calls to the police station, lodging one complaint after another against him. She accused him of harassment, abuse of power, and even planting false evidence. The police department, already well aware of Karen's vindictive nature, dismissed the complaints as the desperate actions of a woman who couldn't accept defeat. But Karen was relentless, and she soon enlisted the help of her equally entitled friends to bombard the station with even more calls. Next, she turned her attention to the coffee shop where the incident had taken place. She started leaving scathing online reviews, accusing the staff of poor service, rude behavior, and even health code violations. She encouraged her friends and family members to do the same, and soon, the once thriving establishment was facing a veritable PR nightmare. The owners of the coffee shop, a young couple who had poured their life savings into the business, were devastated. They tried to reach out to Karen, apologizing profusely and offering to make amends, but she refused to listen. To her, this was a personal vendetta, and she wasn't about to let it go until she had utterly destroyed them. Emboldened by her success in tarnishing the reputations of those who had crossed her, Karen set her sights on her final target, the man who had dared to confront her in the coffee shop. She began digging into his personal life, uncovering every bit of information she could find. She discovered that he was a local high school teacher, and she immediately set to work contacting the school district, accusing him of inappropriate behavior with students. She even went so far as to create a fake social media profile, posing as a concerned parent and spreading lurid rumors about his conduct. The school district, inundated with calls and emails from irate parents, was forced to launch an investigation. The teacher, a respected and beloved member of the community, found himself suddenly under a cloud of suspicion, his career and reputation hanging in the balance. As the weeks passed, Karen reveled in the chaos she had unleashed. She watched with glee as the coffee shop struggled to stay afloat. The police department became increasingly frustrated with her constant harassment, and the teacher's life was turned upside down. But little did she know that her reign of terror was about to come to a screeching halt, thanks to a surprising turn of events that would leave her stunned and helpless. As Karen's campaign of vengeance continued, her once privileged life began to unravel at the seams. The constant barrage of complaints and false accusations had taken a toll on the police department, the coffee shop, and the teacher she had targeted, but it had also drawn the attention of a formidable adversary, the local news media. Investigative reporters, intrigued by the bizarre chain of events, began digging into Karen's background and the accusations she had leveled. What they uncovered was a shocking pattern of behavior that painted a very different picture of the so-called respected member of the community. It turned out that Karen had a long history of similar incidents, where she had used her position of power and influence to bully and intimidate anyone who dared to challenge her. From local business owners to government officials, she had left a trail of ruined reputations and shattered lives in her wake. The news team wasted no time in putting together a damning expose, detailing Karen's abusive tactics and the collateral damage she had left in her path. The story quickly went viral, sparking outrage and calls for accountability from the community. Within days, the police department was flooded with new complaints, not against Officer Jenkins or the coffee shop, but against Karen herself. Dozens of people came forward, sharing their own harrowing experiences with the woman and demanding that she be held accountable for her actions. The pressure on the authorities became too intense to ignore, and they were forced to launch a full-scale investigation into Karen's past. What they uncovered was a litany of offenses, ranging from harassment and abuse to financial fraud and even tax evasion. As the evidence against her mounted, Karen's world began to crumble. Her once formidable legal team abandoned her, and her friends and allies quickly distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the growing scandal. Facing the prospect of criminal charges and the very real possibility of jail time, Karen was left with no choice but to surrender. In a humiliating spectacle, she was led out of her home in handcuffs, the cameras of the local news crews capturing every moment of her downfall. As she was loaded into the back of the police car, Karen's once haughty demeanor had been replaced by a look of utter despair. The realization that her actions had finally caught up with her was a bitter pill to swallow, and she knew that this time there would be no escaping the consequences of her entitled and abusive behavior. As the news of Karen's arrest spread, the community she had once dominated was filled with a mix of shock, relief, and a sense of long overdue justice. The coffee shop owners, who had been on the brink of bankruptcy due to Karen's relentless campaign against them, finally breathed a sigh of relief. "It's been a nightmare," the co-owner, Sarah, told a reporter. "But I'm just grateful that this is finally coming to an end. We can start to rebuild and move on with our lives." The teacher who had been the target of Karen's vicious smear campaign was equally relieved. He had been placed on administrative leave while the school district investigated the allegations, but now, with the truth finally coming to light, he was eager to return to the classroom and resume his life. "I'm just thankful that the truth has been revealed," he said. "It's been a difficult few weeks, but I never doubted that justice would prevail in the end." For Officer Jenkins, the resolution of the case was bittersweet. While he was pleased to see Karen held accountable for her actions, the ordeal had taken a toll on him both professionally and personally. "I was just doing my job, trying to maintain order and keep the peace," he said. "But the way she tried to turn it around and ruin my career was truly despicable. I'm glad it's over, but the damage she's done will take time to heal." As Karen sat in her cell, the weight of her actions finally sinking in, she found herself confronted with a harsh reality. The power and privilege she had once wielded so effortlessly had crumbled, and she was now at the mercy of a system she had always believed was beneath her. Her lawyers, who had once vowed to fight tooth and nail to clear her name, now refused to take her calls. Her wealthy and influential friends, who had once catered to her every whim, had abandoned her, unwilling to be associated with the growing scandal. In the end, Karen's downfall was not the result of a single incident, but rather the culmination of a lifetime of entitled and abusive behavior. Her inability to accept responsibility for her actions and her belief that she was above the law had ultimately led to her undoing. As she sat alone in her cell, contemplating the ruins of her once privileged life, Karen could not help but wonder if she had finally met her match. A system that refused to bend to her will, and a community that had finally found the courage to stand up to her. In the weeks that followed Karen's arrest, the community that had once been terrorized by her actions began to heal and rebuild. The coffee shop owners, with the support of their loyal customers, managed to weather the storm and emerged stronger than ever. The teacher who had been the target of Karen's vicious smear campaign was reinstated, and the school district issued a public apology for the way he had been treated. He returned to the classroom with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to make a positive impact on the lives of his students. As for Officer Jenkins, the outpouring of support from his colleagues and the community at large helped to ease the sting of Karen's relentless attacks. He was commended for his professionalism and integrity, and the department's leadership made it clear that they stood firmly behind him. Meanwhile, Karen's once formidable legal team had abandoned her, leaving her to navigate the complex legal system on her own. She was eventually convicted on a litany of charges, including harassment, abuse of power, and financial fraud, and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. During her time behind bars, Karen was forced to confront the harsh realities of her actions. She watched as her once enviable lifestyle crumbled, her wealth and influence reduced to nothing. The privilege and entitlement that had once shielded her from the consequences of her behavior were now her greatest liabilities. As the months passed, Karen's defiant spirit slowly began to wither. She found herself surrounded by other inmates who had also been the victims of her entitled and abusive behavior, and for the first time in her life, she was forced to acknowledge the true depth of the harm she had caused. Gradually, a glimmer of remorse began to emerge, and Karen found herself wrestling with the realization that her actions had not only ruined the lives of others, but had also irrevocably damaged her own. She had sacrificed everything: her freedom, her reputation, and ultimately, her humanity, in a futile quest to maintain her grip on power. As the final days of her sentence approached, Karen found herself facing an uncertain future. The community she had once dominated had moved on, and the bridges she had burned would be difficult, if not impossible, to rebuild. But perhaps, in the quiet moments of reflection, she might find a path towards redemption, a way to atone for her sins and reclaim her humanity. Only time would tell what the future held for Karen, but one thing was certain: her reign of entitled and abusive behavior had come to a decisive and well-deserved end.